Hello everyone, my name is Josh and this is Whimsical and Interesting Musings, or WHIMs as I like to call it. And today I'm going to be doing a review for the David Cronenberg film Dead Ringers, which was released in 1988, and it was co-written by David Cronenberg and Norman Snyder, and it was directed by David Cronenberg. It's based on a novel called Twins by Barry Wood and Jack Giesland, and it follows twin gynecologists by the name of Dr. Elliot and Beverly Mantle, played by Jeremy Irons. And this film is really interesting to me. In fact, it's one of David Cronenberg's most significant films to date. It's a psychological thriller, as opposed to a outright horror or sci-fi horror film, which is what most of his career was known for up until about the late 80s, which was when this film was released. Up until that point, he had directed body horror films like The Brood, The Fly, Rabid and Shivers and Videodrome, just to name a few, and now he has pretty much bridged the gap by making the film Dead Ringers. He will go on to later make films like Naked Lunch and Crash to kind of mark the transitional period from pure body horror to psychological films that focus more on mankind's relationship with technology, mankind's relationship with each other, and the more psychological aspects of the human condition. So, Dead Ringers follows a pair of twin gynecologists by the name of Dr. Elliot and Beverly Mantle, and they pretty much shared everything. They have shared many different things, including toys, apartments, and even lovers. And they have also shared a practice. They're pretty much, business partners. And they pretty much seem to have it all. They're very much respected in their field. They are literally recommended to people. Like, people always say things like, oh, you have to recommend the Mantle twins. They're amazing. They have the best gynecological practice in town. But things start to change when an actress by the name of Claire Nouveau is introduced into their practice, and when Beverly, one of the twins, the more sensitive type, sees that Claire Nouveau can't have children, despite the fact that she's a very famous actress and her life is empty without children, things start to take a very interesting turn. And that's where I think the film really starts to delve into a very interesting topic about the body, more particularly the female body in this particular film, and it's a very disturbing watch from a psychological perspective, because it plays on the idea of duality, it plays on the idea of identity, it plays on various themes of codependency, especially in regards to the central character of Beverly and his relationship with his twin brother Elliot. I'm going to first of all talk about the Mantle twins themselves. They are very successful, they share practice, they share an apartment, and they even share each other. They even share, their partners, excuse me, I beg your pardon. That would be an interesting twist, wouldn't it? But no, they share lovers as well. And sometimes they share lovers without the lover actually knowing which one of the twins they are sleeping with. And that, to me, is really disturbing. But what's very interesting about this film is it tackles the theme of identity in the way the Mantles see each other, like in the very opening scene when they're starting to get up and get a lot of recognition in the world. They are one of the twins, Elliot, who's kind of like the face of Mantle Inc. He's the guy who wears the suits, he has the charm, he has the charisma, he can get people into his practice and even certain people into his bed as well. But he pretty much, when they're starting to get successful, they have a solid gold mantle retractor that basically allows them to look inside cadavers, but they can also, help perform physical examinations on their patients. And when they get, congratulated and their device becomes the standard of the gynecological industry, Elliot makes an appearance and he accepts the award, and he goes back to his dorm. And he goes to his brother, Beverly, "It was wonderful, Beverly, you should have been there." And Beverly replies, "I was." So this line pretty much tells me right off the bat that the Mantle twins don't necessarily see each other as separate people with separate minds and separate personalities. They see each other as one person, and this kind of highlights the idea of codependency. That's one example of codependency being used in this film. And it also taps into the idea of identity, which is that they don't necessarily see each other as two separate people with separate personalities or separate minds, even though they are. They see each other as just one person. That's one example. And the second example is when they're talking about Claire and pursuing a potential client and doctor relationship with Claire, and possibly a more intimate relationship with Claire. One of the twins decides to engage in the relationship, but he's very awkward. He doesn't know a lot about romance or how to, charm anyone or anything like that, or anything really flirtatious. He's very awkward, very stiff. And you can really tell which one's which from how each and every single one of these characters behaves. Because Beverly is the shy one. He's the one who, if you were to say which one's the genius and which one's the face and the publicity guy of the entire duo, I'd say Elliot is the charming guy, the one who goes to all the parties, makes the big speeches, and charms anyone that he can. Whereas Beverly is the guy who sits up in his room and he basically, does research and does the inventing. He's the brains of the outfit. And I think that's very interesting because when he goes to go flirt with Claire, he's very awkward. He's very kind of, all over the place. He doesn't know what to do. He just tells her what she needs to hear. Like he says, you aren't going to be able to have children. And she wants him to do things to her. And one of the things is to be spanked. And that's when it really starts to get, into much more, very difficult and very tricky territory for the twins, because when he brings this back to Elliot, he says, well, if you won't go to see Claire, I will, and I'll tell her I'm you, and I'll do terrible things to her. And that's all I'm really going to say about that. And if it kind of gives the impression that Elliot's the kind of more direct brother. He's the more dominant brother. He's the one who makes all the big decisions. He's the one who, gets his way a lot of the time. But he is, for the most part, a terrible person. He's awful. He's sleazy. He can charm people, but his charm can only get him so far. He's a terrible person, but on the whole, he is basically a good person when it matters. But what I really do like about this particular scene, especially the scene with them sharing pizza, I like the fact that, he says things like, you haven't had an experience, and unless I've had it too, so you really do get this impression that they are literally linked. They literally have a cord between the two of them that can't be broken. They have this sort of almost psychic link or biological link or this telekinetic link, I suppose you could say, or psychological or telepathic link. But they are pretty much, in sync with each other. And that's really horrifying, but also it's really kind of... I know it's going to be weird, but it's also kind of sweet that they feel like they have this connectivity as well. And that's one of the things that I will definitely say about this film, is the way it depicts twins and the way they behave towards each other is actually very interestingly presented here. Because I'm going to go onto a little bit of a tangent, but before this film came out, the twin formula was kind of only depicted as two very different extremes. You either have the very kind of comical side, which is where the similar identities and the mix-ups are played for laughs, and then you have the psychological horror or thriller angle, which is that one twin's the really good and really sweet and very generous twin, the other one's the psychotic killer. And David Cronenbergs said that he never really saw a twin film that actually depicted twins as genuine human beings. And this film does it, because you really do get a sense of who Beverly is when you watch the film. You know who Elliot is. And even when I was rewatching it for this particular review and making notes, I found myself actually quite surprised because I switched the subtitles on. And whenever Elliot is speaking, or whenever Beverly is speaking, excuse me, you always see that it's written in blue. Whereas whenever you hear Elliot speak, it's written in gold or, yellow. And I really do like that aspect that you can tell who it is, even though technically it could very easily be a different person or the same person. So it really is an interesting detail there on the format I was watching it on, which is ITVX. And that I thought was fantastic. But what I think is very interesting is when Claire finds out, she pretty much has a reaction, which is understandable because she does feel angry. She's angry at Elliot, but then she's also angry at Bev, and she gives them that good chuck of the water over his face. And she's very angry, understandably, and she even says, you're the sensitive one who plays them into a false sense of security, and then along comes Dracula here to polish them off, kind of thing. And I love that. The humour in this film is brilliant. But what I think is important is that the way this film is framed is there's no real villains or heroes in this film. Because in a lot of Hollywood films, this particular relationship between these two people, the way Elliot's behaving, you think he'd be the villain. But in a way, Claire's not a saint either. She's a character who, when Beverly starts to see her a lot more, and he starts to, get a little bit more intimate and a little bit more confident, he starts to have dreams about him waking up next to Claire, but Elliot's also there, and there's this giant lump of flesh that's kind of connecting the two of them together. And he's kind of very afraid. He's very, cautious. And he's like, no, I don't want to be here. I don't want him to be here. And then Claire just goes, well, maybe I'll have to just separate the two of you. And then she proceeds to go down and take a bite out of the mass and pull a great big lump of flesh, bloodied flesh, off of the mass. And it's horrific. But this scene is actually really brilliant because it shows you, without really telling you, what this scene represents. Like, for Elliot, it's almost orgasmic, the prospect of, being separated. But he's not really going to care that much about it. But to Beverly, it's the most painful thing in the world. And there's even a line that he says towards the end of the film, separation can be a very terrifying thing. And that literally is his prospect. Like, he's terrified of the idea of being separated from his brother, but then he also wants to be with Claire because he's starting to have feelings for her. So that's one dilemma. But the way it's depicted is, usually in a Hollywood film, the actual villain would be Elliot. But Claire isn't the saint either. She's the one who has the problems. She starts to get addicted to pills because she is essentially, trying to medicate for, coming to terms with the revelation that she's no longer going to have children, so she has to medicate, she has to deal with her moods, and Beverly prescribes them to her, but then he very slowly starts to cope with his separation anxiety in a way that's not very recommendable, which is he starts to take the pills himself in order to stop dreaming about that very horrible dream that he had where he's attached to his brother. And it's really sad, and you really do care for Beverly, and it's really heartbreaking to see him grow. Jeremy Irons in this, I have to say, Jeremy Irons, whenever he's playing Beverly, I actually really do feel sorry for him. Like, whenever he does feel sad, you almost do want to hug him because you really do feel like he's really taking the weight, and he really kind of feels like the more sensitive one of the two. So everything's good for a while until he starts to establish very erratic behaviours. He's very quick to anger whenever, Claire brings up a point about him and his brother. Like, say, for example, she makes a reference to the fact that your name's Beverly, and isn't that a woman's name? And your brother's name is Ellie. Isn't that a woman's name too? And he goes, what do you think? Do you think I'm gay or something? And he actually really gets offended by it, and he really gets, angry with her for for saying that, and he even says, "What is this psychoanalytical bullshit you're throwing at me?" and things like that. Like, he really gets angry at her, and that really just goes to show how much of a downward spiral he's going. He's literally being, not only is his character being kind of almost examined, but also his masculinity is being challenged, and also his sense of self is being challenged, because he doesn't feel quite himself. So he has to. That literally prompts him to keep medicating, until eventually he becomes almost dependent on it. He can't eat his food whenever he's eating breakfast. He stays in late, and he even says to Claire, ask my receptionist to cancel my first 3 patients. And he starts to go on a downward spiral until Claire decides to go away to do some filming, because she's an actress. And this is when things really start to get worse. He ends up, calling Claire, and her agent picks up, and he begins to say things like, "Oh, have you examined her yet? And you'll see that she has 3 doorways in her uterus, meaning that by the time you get there, you'll realise you've been fucking a mutant," and things like that. And and it's horrible, it's disturbing, but part of me also laughs whenever I see that scene, because the agent's like, "Who is this? Is that you, Brian?" and things like that. So there's little bits of humour in this film, and I really just love it. But what's really great is Beverly's downward spiral. He goes from one extreme to another. It gets to the point where he literally, at a certain point, he ends up, creating these surgical instruments that are used for working on mutant women. And he goes to this artist, this guy whose job it is to basically make this stuff for an exhibition, and he says, "I want to have these instruments made in surgical steel that will help work on mutant women." And the guy's like, "Oh, that would be a good idea for a show." And he goes, "No, these are important, medical instruments that I need." And it's just one downward spiral from there. There's a scene where he's examining a woman, and he's using the mantle retractor, but he uses the wrong one. And he goes, "When did you last have sex to this person that he's examining?" And she goes, "Oh, I don't remember." And he goes, "Well, who or what did you have sex with?" And she goes, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "I was once asked to examine a woman who seemingly had sexual intercourse with a Labrador retriever." And then she has this shocked look in her eyes. And then he turns to her with this little sideways look, and he goes, "I was wondering if maybe..." And then he gives this look as if to say, "Well..." And she literally has this look on her face as if to say, "Of course not." Oh, I love Dead Ringers. Yeah, this film is really funny. I actually really think, even though David Cronenberg is known as the Baron of Blood, and he's known as, the real king of, or the prince of body horror or gory horror films, he is actually a really funny writer. A lot of his films are really funny, and you really do get that sense in this film. There's also another great scene where Claire is talking to her agent at the very start of the film, and he says things like, "I don't want you to be humiliated," and she goes, "Oh, I need the humiliation as well as the money." But then she starts to go on about, she turns to Beverly, and she says, "Well, tell me about my uterus." And then the agent just goes, and things like that. So, I love how he does dark humour. I really do. It's really great. And there's this one other great scene which kind of ties into the plot where, in terms of humour, where he's examining this woman, he's doing surgery on this woman, and one of the people who are doing the surgery with him literally looks at the instruments. He's taking the instruments that he's using to examine mutant women, and he's basically, she has this look on her face, like she has this very wide-eyed look on her face as she's looking down at these instruments, and she's literally thinking what we're all thinking in our heads. Like, she's thinking, what the hell are you going to do with these? And it's funny, but it's also really terrifying, because you know what it's like when you're, even if you're not, familiar with gynecology or anything like that, the fact that you're literally in a medical practice, and you're being operated on. That's such a horrible feeling that you don't quite know what your doctor's going through, what his mood's going to be in. And I think it really does a great job of really kind of playing that scene for laughs, but you're also kind of terrified about what he's going to do to this poor woman who's been, anaesthetized. So things go from bad to worse when Elliot finds out that he's basically been taking drugs. But instead of trying to wean him off it, which is what a lot of people would do, he then starts to realise that he's fighting a losing battle, and he decides, we need to resync each other. We need to keep in sync. And if Bevy goes down, I go down with him. So there's that element of codependency. And one of the codependency themes that I forgot to mention was the theme of drug addiction, which is, of course, what you do. And, of course, the best way to describe codependency is when you're drowning, you see someone else's life before your eyes. And that's kind of very similar. And the sense that they don't really feel like each other. Like, yeah, they've gotten so used to kind of swapping roles every once in a while, that they literally can't tell each other apart. And it literally gets so bad to the point where Elliot starts to go down a spiral. And he ends up, taking a lot of drugs. And he literally regresses to that of like an excited child. Like when he gets... when they're talking about, what sort of drugs they'll take to calm themselves down and how they'll wean themselves off the drugs, he's talking about it. He's reacting like he's, about to go to the park or go to the zoo or go to the cinema to go and see a film or something like that. Like, he's very excited about it, like he's a child. And there's even this great moment where they're eating cake and he goes, "Oh, no ice cream?" And he goes, "No, Elliot, Mummy forgot." And he goes, "Oh, I just wanted some ice cream." But it's a great performance. I love Jeremy Irons in this film. This is a fantastic role. He should have gotten an Oscar for this film, and he even did one better because the following year he was in a film called Reversal of Fortune. And when he was going to go and accept his Oscar, he thanked David Cronenberg for his work on Dead Ringers, because I feel like this film is amazing, because his performance is really wonderful. He does a very good job of kind of, differentiating the two characters of Elliot and Beverly Mantle. But there's this wonderful scene where he is playing Beverly, and he is basically going to the office to see Elliot, and he's literally in a crying stupor. He's literally inconsolable, and he's saying, "Oh, I just found out that Claire is having an affair," and Elliot goes, he then goes on to explain what he thought he saw or what he thought he heard, and then Beverly just goes, "I'm in love with her," and he starts to cry, and the look on his face when he says the words, even the way his voice sort of starts to blubber as he's saying the words, "I'm in love with her," that part breaks my heart. And it really goes to show that Jeremy Irons is such an incredible actor, and he's able to play these two roles so exceptionally well, and it's just brilliant. This film is fantastic. I would highly recommend it if you're a fan of David Cronenbergs. This film is just gold, and I feel like this is one of my favourite David Cronenberg films, even though I don't really have a favourite when it comes to David Cronenberg's films, because I think all his films have a degree of skill, have a degree of great storytelling to them. And a lot of his films are very character driven. They don't really have a plot per se. And even though there is a plot and there is something, happening in every single film, it feels like every single scene feels like a very intimate examination of something or other. And this was literally right off the back of a film like The Fly, where the whole entire point of that film was to take a creature feature type film, like Turning into a Fly, a science fiction horror concept, and make it a metaphor for aging, disease, and especially it was seen by a lot of critics at the time as a metaphor for the AIDS epidemic and people who are suffering with the AIDS virus, and also the people who are around them who are also suffering as well, watching their loved ones die. And in David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers, it's more a psychological study of two one face, two bodies, one mind. And it really is just a fantastic film. It's brilliantly cast, it's brilliantly written. Again, there's a lot of funny stuff. It isn't just a complete and utter, downer all the time. It is actually very funny. There's a lot of really great sequences. There are even some really funny sequences that I haven't even told you about in this review that I think a lot of people should see this film for. But this film is just such a great film to watch. If you're interested in checking it out, I definitely recommend watching it on ITVX if you're able to. If you're in the UK, it's definitely free to watch on there. And I'm going to do something else, which I don't usually do on my channel. I don't usually give a preview of what films or novels I'm going to tackle next, but I'm just going to get it very quickly. Did you know David Cronenberg wrote a novel? And that's going to be one of my next videos. I don't know when it will be, but I will be definitely checking this out at some point. So stay tuned for that review. And this has been Josh with Whimsical and Interesting Musings. And I hope you're all having a very good day. Take care. Bye-bye for now.